my name is Dario Hasenstab. I have a degree in international affairs, and I'm here with Balder Hagritz, a former university professor of mine, as well as an IR consultant. And together, we're bursting the Western bubble. Today, we will analyze how to understand development aid through the lens of the Western bubble. Because while Western societies have many strengths and significant weaknesses, in order to analyze these, we use the concept of the Western bubble. Boulder won almost last time, I believe. We will release the listeners of this shortly. What is the Western bubble?
It is the process in which people in Western democracies live under the delusion that their system is the ultimate goal of humanity and that because of that there is an inherent superiority over other systems. This then leads to both blindness to our own internal weakness as well as destructive behavior towards those living in different systems.
Every episode of this podcast follows the same structure. In order to analyze each topic, we answer the following 5 questions. What are the facts, where we provide a factual basis for our analysis? What is the bubble, where we analyze the overarching problem of Western delusion? What is the personal bias, where we see how the leaders, especially Western leaders, are affected by non-rational factors? What is the damage, where we look into how and why the Western bubble is harmful? And finally, what is the future, where we lay out how each topic might develop down the line. If you would like to know more about how this podcast started or who we are, make sure to listen to our introduction episode. This being said, let's get to it. Development aid is a type of foreign aid given by governments and other agencies to support the economic, environmental, social, and political development of developing countries. As opposed to short-term intentions of humanitarian aid, development aid has a long-term agenda. About 80% of the aid measured by the OECD comes from government sources. In total, roughly $130 billion last year, while the remaining 20% come from individuals, businesses, foundations, or NGOs. OECD countries are responsible for the vast majority of aid provided worldwide, and the top 3 donor countries in total billions from 2010 to 2019 were the United States, Germany, and the United Kingdom. Meanwhile, the top 3 receiving countries in the same time frame were Afghanistan, India, and Ethiopia. Historically, the concept of development aid goes back to the colonial era at the turn of the 20th century, and particularly to the British policy of colonial development. However, the beginning of modern development aid is rooted in post-World War II times and the Cold War. It was launched as a large-scale aid program by the United States in 1947, called the Marshall Plan, which was concerned with strengthening the ties to Western European states and to contain the influence of the USSR. The current sector comes from the area of decolonization, when structures were set up to support local populations. Moving on to the second category, what is the bubble? Before we discuss what is the Western bubble here, I think it is important that we discuss our own bubble because, as I always mentioned in the introduction, I'm a former student of yours, and you actually taught a class on aid and development to me. And I can say so much that it was a very critical class on aid and development, and I think listeners will notice because it's subject to our podcast here. So that's kind of our own little bubble, and we will both be careful not to rant too much about the development world. But then, Balder, why do you even teach a class on aid and development? Are you some form of expert?
Well, I used to be a long time ago. It's how I started my international relations career. While doing my PhD, I was offered a position first to just write some articles for a website of a think tank that was led by one of my professors, and then eventually that led me to enter the development sector as a 26, 27-year-old, where they invited me to become part of the organization, and I started becoming a consultant on development projects. I became an evaluator, and so for at least 6-7 years I was very much at the heart. I was part of this aid culture, right? I was there evaluating projects on behalf of European and international donors, and so I could observe everything, but I also very much was inside of that bubble without clearly seeing my role in it. So it's very good that you talk about biases, because I think that right now it's fair to say that I walk around with a certain guilt complex because of the money I made from this sector for a long time. And unfortunately, when I then walk into a classroom full of students, I try to make them avoid the same mistakes that I made.
And then, so before we then fully dive into the bubble, we also want to mention that, I mean, of course, we're not in general against international cooperation and against any of these efforts, but it's very much about analyzing the mistakes that stem from a bubble, the development bubble, but also the Western bubble.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's very important to realize for listeners here that there are sort of two streams of criticism, critical thinking against the aid sector, and one is the one that hopefully we engage in, the one that is just analyzing what the patterns are, what the impact is, what the incentives are for actors involved, and then say, does this work? Is this actually a good way to manage our world, to spend our resources, etc.? The other one is a slightly darker political movement, I would argue, which comes from typically the extreme right, which goes along the lines of why should we spend money on foreigners if we have so many problems at home? Why should a American spend money on people in Somalia if there are so many poor Americans? And that is a line of thought that needs to be rejected for the simple reason that we live in a globe and international cooperation is a brilliant thing. The idea of the world working together is hugely important. We can't live in our own national bubble. So our criticism doesn't stem from the idea that there's something wrong with countries and populations all over the world working together. We should only celebrate that kind of thing.
And then now let's jump right into it. Balder, what is the bubble? I mean, I mean, because I feel like there's not one unitary bubble. There has to be a few ones, right, inside this overarching development sector.
Yeah, and in many ways, I would argue that the aid sector is a brilliant example of the Western bubble in general, right? A lot of the elements that we've discussed in previous episodes are very clearly visible in the aid sector. And here it's probably useful to distinguish between the geopolitical bubble, the West being the West, its neo-colonial self. I'm sure we'll unpack that. Um, then there's the organizational managerial bubble, which incentives exist within organizations, donors within the aid sector, governments or large foundations, as well as NGOs. What incentives exist for them to operate? Who do they respond to? What do they count as success? And then there's the very individual bubble, right? Westerners, if not the whole aid sector consists of Westerners, but it's very much still Western led. Uh, Westerners believing in their own moral imperative and believing that they're actually making the world a better place and the impact that it has on their operations.
So starting with the governmental sector, I mean, I read this out in the fact sheet that the kind of the first form of modern aid was the Marshall Plan from the United States, and I mean, I'm just going to read the second half of the sentence again. Is that it was concerned with strengthening ties to Western European states and to contain the influence of the USSR. I mean, this gives the governmental perspective an immediate agenda, right? A policymaking agenda.
Yeah, so international cooperation, and in this case foreign aid, always has a selfish aspect to it. It doesn't have to be completely selfish, but there's always a element of what are we getting out of this, and there's nothing wrong with that. When you and I cooperate together, I get something out of it and you get something out of it. In the case of the Marshall Plan, the geopolitics were very clear. The Soviet Union had to be stopped from an American perspective. How do you do that? By strengthening Western Europe. And Western Germany, France, the UK, they needed to be able to build up their societies, their militaries, in order to be a buffer. That's a very clear element, and there's in itself nothing wrong with that. It's just important to recognize that, right? It's important to identify that and do not to behave as if it was just the United States out of the goodness of its heart helping Europeans without any other motives behind it, without any ulterior motives. The one thing that is important to mention with the Marshall Plan, and we did mention this in a previous episode, if I recall correctly, is that you're absolutely right that it is the basis of many types of thinking with respect to foreign aid, but it was a very specific situation. It was a situation where you had European societies that before the war, before 1939, were doing pretty well and had large institutions, well functioning institutions, were on their democratic path, had good systems of taxation, had good education levels. And all that the United States needed to do after the Second World War was pump money into those existing systems, which is not comparable to, let's say, the Democratic Republic of Congo in 1960, 1970, which is a very different type of problem where it's not just a matter of throwing some money at it and everything will start working again, right? So that comparison between the Marshall Plan and more modern foreign aid projects can be very deceptive.
And I mean, it is problematic. Is because and this was, I think it was in the last episode, even in the one on US foreign policy, and I think specifically the fall of US foreign policy, is that the Marshall Plan was so successful is that nowadays we always talk about, oh, we need a Marshall Plan for Ukraine, we need a Marshall Plan for Africa. Basically, the same way of thinking applied to completely different contexts. Okay, so here we have then the governmental level where, I mean, so first we had the Marshall Plan, and then I mean the second step of modern aid that I outlined in the fact sheet was then after efforts of decolonization, there was, and we called this support to local populations. But that was us laying out the facts. But when it comes to level of analysis, there were other intentions behind this.
No, absolutely. I mean, if you so the modern sector exists in its form and it has changed over time since the 1960s, and it is very very clear that even though the story was, oh, those countries are now becoming independent but they still need our benevolent help, this is very much from a colonial mindset. That keep in mind that if you asked a European in the 1940s 1950s, they were, from their perspective, from their bubble, and it's an incredible bubble and it requires quite a lot of mental intellectual gymnastics to get there, but they were helping their colonies, right? They believed in their, when they looked in the mirror, that they were doing good to those poor people who couldn't help themselves. Then these poor people are becoming independent, and then they say, oh, but they can't be independent without our support, without our help, so we need to continue providing them with support. That is the western mindset, and it seems kind of insane to even talk about that in 2022, because nobody in their right frame of mind can look at history and think that European colonial powers were actually benevolent to their colonies, but that was the mindset. In reality, though, there is very much this control element, right? They're becoming independent, but we still want to make sure that we can get access to their resources. We want to control their politics. We don't want them to fall into the hands of the Soviet Union. There's a nice Marshall Plan um, parallel. And therefore, by providing them with economic aid, we can influence the local situation and we can use that to our geopolitical benefit. That is very clearly a pattern in the start of the aid sector, and one that is still visible in 2022. And I think there's no better example than the Democratic Republic of Congo for this. Previously Zaire, when it became independent from Belgium, where it actually had its own democratically elected leader, Lumumba, in 1960, and within a year you had 6,000 Belgian mercenaries helping, and I'm doing a quotation mark here, that's something that you can't see in a podcast, helping the Zairean people to stabilize. But in reality, Belgium continuing its access to their natural resources and getting rid of Lumumba within a year, who got then executed. And since then, Zaire and the DRC have been dictatorships, right? Authoritarian regimes. That is a very good example of Europeans in their minds telling themselves, we are actually here to support them, but in reality just wanting to control their former colonies. And that's called neocolonialism.
Hmm. So governments have their own agenda, and it's usually resulting in neocolonialism. But then, what's the organizational perspective? Because it's, so you have these development agencies, which are governmental agencies, but you also have the corporations or the NGOs. What's their perspective on development aid, and what's their bubble?
So the aid sector is really interesting in this sense, and it's relatively unique because it's a cross-border beast, right? It involves almost every country on this planet. And the organizations purport to support local populations. If you ask anyone working in the aid sector, what is your goal? What is your eventual objective for your organization, for your business, for your foundation, for your government department? It is to provide support to vulnerable populations or populations that aren't vulnerable, but to help them develop economically um, towards a better future. Unfortunately, in reality, these organizations don't have those populations as their clients or as their final arbitrators. So when I say I'm going to help that local population, that is my eventual goal, but that local population doesn't evaluate my success, isn't my client, and it doesn't have to be capitalist, it can be different ways, but isn't the one who in the end decides whether I've done a good job or not, there's a problem. In reality, my client is the people who provide me with the money. So if I'm an NGO, I will argue that I am helping local people, but in reality, I'm trying to please the donor. Because without the donor, I won't continue to exist. So the incentive mechanism at a managerial organizational level is very much one where on paper you focus on one thing, but in reality you focus on the other. And these two things are not aligned. Very often a donor wants different things than the actual local population. Now, and there have been ways in which people are trying to improve this, but it's actually very hard to change it if you know that the existence of your job or the existence of your organization depends on the happiness of a second party that is not part of your formal agenda.
So, what would be an example of a donor having different interests and goals than the local population?
Well, very clearly, for example, religious or political objectives are very common. So what you would have, for example, is a American foundation who wants to provide democratic ideals at a local level. And locals are not really interested in the politics behind it. They're just interested in a school being built, or they're just interested in roads being built, or some job training program, or whatever it is. But in order to access that, they also have to sort of play this political game because that's what the donor wants. So what you then get is that the NGO starts telling the locals, okay, we're going to help you here, but you also have to have lessons on democracy or on freedom. And there, then the evaluation of that project will not be what the locals want. The locals just want to know, did the school get built? Did we get our job training? But the donor wants to say, okay, how did we democratize this society? How did we actually put liberal values into this society? I mean, one example, I think I can safely mention this, uh, is of a organization that I had to evaluate in the Balkans a long time ago. And the NGO that I was working for just basically was an expert. They just wanted to build buildings. They were good at building buildings. But at the time, the Spanish government, which was financing this, were all on this hype train with respect to peace building. And so the Balkans, 1990s, early 2000s, recovering from the violence that had taken place. And so this organization, in order to get the funds from the Spanish government to build its school or build its infrastructure, they had to develop this whole plan based on peace building, even though that wasn't their expertise in any way, shape, or form. And in the end, I, as an evaluator of the project, had a really tough job because am I going to evaluate their effectiveness, their ability to actually build what they want to build? Or do I have to evaluate what the donor wanted them to do, which is bring peace and prosperity and again democratic liberal values and all singing, all the people in the Balkans holding hands and singing Kumbaya? Is that what I'm evaluating here? And that's a very clear example of how organizationally the process got corrupted and the actual effectiveness becomes very hard to measure then.
And this leaves us with the last level, meaning the individual level. And so, in what ways are individuals stuck in this development and in the Western bubble?
So, if you are working at an NGO in Paris or London or Madrid, your day to day life is just you go into the office, you do your work, and you go home. And there is still probably a sense that you're internally that you're doing something for to make the world better. Your job is morally superior to that of working in the financial sector or working in any other commercial sector because you are working on you're working on helping poor people around the world, right? That's what you tell yourself. But your day-to-day job is just getting into the office, going out, etc. Where it's much more visible is individuals going to local populations. Actually, an American or a European walking into a town in the DRC or walking into a town in South Sudan. Because there, they not only represent from their own personal perspective a moral good, they are probably telling themselves, hey, I could have worked in the private sector and earned a lot more money, which is a questionable statement, but it's good to tell you that yourself that, right? It's just my choice to be here for a relatively low wage, but I could earn a lot more somewhere else. Um, so they walk in with that mindset. I am here doing good and I am somehow praiseworthy for my actions being here. But not just that, I represent a superior system. And this is very much the Western bubble, right? I come from the United States or I come from a European country where we have a brilliant liberal democratic capitalist system. And these poor people here at the local level just have to learn how to do things our way, which is exactly the thing that this podcast series is about. And it's incredibly visible that it's incredibly visible when you are there and you look around at all those Westerners. And so I have been there and I still feel guilty about it, right? And you'd be amazed, by the way, by how well some people, including myself at some point, are being paid to be there. So it's not all voluntary doing good. When you look around at those Westerners working in the aid sector at the local level, the air of superiority and the air of believing that they are gods among men while walking there is sometimes astounding. And if you look at certain figures, for example, of the people walking around in Afghanistan, I haven't seen the latest figures, but about 5 years ago, they were still valid. The huge majority can be categorized as white middle-aged men who walk around with a god complex, essentially, who go there and at home they don't get respected by anyone. Back home in New York or back home in London, nobody cares about them. But in Afghanistan, they can walk around as people representing a superior system, representing money, having a lot of influence over local population, and therefore being incredibly biased in their own actions. And you can easily imagine how that leads to horrible situations of abusive power dynamics and all that.
And I mean, because we've seen this, and this was a recurring subject in the aided development class you taught. We've seen this at its worst in Haiti, right, where you had exactly those people moving into positions of power and then horribly abusing this.
Yeah, so this is, I mean, it's to make it a little bit simplistic and stereotypical, but think about this 50-year-old guy who has a desk job somewhere in New York and has just gone through painful divorce because his wife left him for someone more attractive and more intelligent. And this guy now gets offered a job to work in Haiti to rebuild society after an earthquake. That guy goes there, and all of a sudden, everyone around him seems to admire him. Not in reality, but that's his feeling. That's his feeling because he walks around, he has the money, he has the influence, he has to make big decisions. He represents this big donor overseas. He lives in this big house where poor people around him live in little huts because of the earthquake that destroyed their houses. Uh, he has the power to ruin people's lives or to make lives better. And then obviously that person is gonna feel way more important and way more powerful than he has any right to feel. At home, disrespected, but all of a sudden here, he's like a god. And at that moment, you get those horrific stories of child abuse, of rape, of and it doesn't have to be even that explicit, right? Just simple pressure on local populations to behave in a certain way. And he won't even believe that he's doing anything wrong because he can tell himself that he's there to make Haiti a better place. He can tell himself that he is sacrificing a better wage at home in order to be there. And therefore, he doesn't even look in the mirror and feel anything dodgy about what he's doing. As an evaluator, this was even more so because as an evaluator of projects, for listeners who don't know this, so a project is carried out by an NGO or is carried out by an executive party on behalf of a donor, and then an external evaluator flies in and has to see whether all the targets have been met and what has gone well and what has gone badly. So I wasn't just this guy walking around, I was a guy who had to write a report, say, okay, money is going to continue or money will stop, which gave me even greater power, right? At least um, on paper. And that feeling of being treated like someone who can make or break the future careers of people around you is very clearly present there. And I've shown pictures in class, which again on a podcast can't happen unfortunately, but I've shown pictures of where I was welcomed in villages with the whole village standing in front of me and whole groups of children preparing songs for me, singing. And I was just a 28-year-old who had absolutely no clue what he was doing there, and was just earning a lot of money for doing something pretty basic and pretty uh, unimportant, really. But these people believed that their economic future depended on me, and as a result, you get treated in such a way.
Shouldn't this be obvious to someone who walks into a room as an evaluator?
Well, no, I'm sure that that is something that if we have listeners who are actually work in the sector and who believe in the work that they're doing, they will tell themselves, "Yeah, but I'm not like that," or "This is you're exaggerating." And of course, here for the purpose of this episode, we have to exaggerate a little, or at least simplify a little bit, because we don't have enough time to go into all the complexities. But it is astounding how our human psychology justifies our own behavior when we can see it being problematic in the behavior of others, right? It's much easier for us to criticize others than to critically evaluate ourselves. And so what happens, and I certainly did this, but I told myself while I was walking around and earning all this money and sort of playing God, I told myself, yeah, but I won't fall into the trap. I won't do anything abusive. I can see how others could do it, but I'm here for the right reasons, and I'm just gonna be professional and all that. And yet, it's gonna be very, very easy to get into dynamics that you don't easily observe about yourself, right? And so I think the ability to be self-delusional in human beings is much higher than we think. And it's very clear that whereas you have a conversation with people who work in the sector, they say, yeah, this is indeed a problem, you're right, but we do things differently. And then when you actually start observing them, they don't do things differently, but they just don't see it about themselves.
Now we've discussed the individual bubble after we already discussed the governmental bubble and the organizational bubble. I mean, part of the individual is obviously the personal bias, leading us to our third category. What is the personal bias? And here, I think it it will be important for us to discuss kind of how helping is power. Because we discussed this earlier a little bit, but I think we need to put some more focus on this. How as soon as you help someone, there's immediately a perception of power involved.
Yeah, the word helping is very problematic, right? And that's why cooperation, I mentioned this before, if you and I cooperate, I get something out of it, you get something out of it, and it's hopefully a productive dynamic for both of us. And that is something that leads to constructive, good outcomes. When I know what I get and you know what you get, and we're happy that both of us benefit from it. But when we help, it is based when I help you, I am actually saying you have to be grateful to me. I am here doing good. You are vulnerable. You are weak. I am strong.
I know
And
better.
I know better. I represent a lot of good stuff. You represent a lot of bad stuff. And this dynamic is not an equal one. I am superior. You're inferior. Now, when you then translate that to the aid sector, that's very, very visible, right? Where it is all about pretending that there is no mutual benefit, even though we know from political perspectives and from personal perspectives there clearly is. But it is all about me as an individual out of the goodness of my heart. Mother Teresa comes to mind here, right? There was this pretense that Mother Teresa was out of the goodness of her heart. She spends her time on the poor people in India. Whereas in reality, that's of course not true, but that is a huge, hugely powerful bubble that we live in.
And something that, especially when we talk about the personal bias, because I mean, I mentioned this earlier, is something that happens to young people of my generation in particular, is this feeling of, ooh, just traveling around the world for 1 year because I'm done with high school now and I deserve to see the world for personal development or whatever. An alternative to this is, oh, let me go and help. Let me go and volunteer somewhere. And I mean, during my time at university and during your class, I think I even wrote an essay about this, about voluntourism. How there are volunteers who are going out into the world, and it's really just tourism because, and this is how this generally goes, is then you have someone, usually middle class student from the Western world, the United States or Europe, going into a small African town to teach English for 1 month, believing that, oh, I'm going to change that person's world. But even worse, usually even paying an organization to do so. Because this is something that almost happened to me. At the age of 17, I seriously considered going to Costa Rica for 3 months to improve my Spanish, but also to help something with the rainforest. And the price for this would have been 3,600 euros. But instead of having this money then go somewhere good, no, it's going into his administration stuff. It's going into feeding me, into making sure that I have healthcare and access to everything, just so that I can walk around in Costa Rica, feel good about myself, and say, oh, I've saved the rainforest for 3 months and I learned Spanish on the side.
Absolutely. And it's not just about you feeling good about yourself, it is you advancing your career. It looks great in your CV, it makes you look interesting at home. It gives you personally wonderful experiences. It broadens your horizons in certain ways, right? Uh, and you do all of that, so you strengthen your own life in many ways, and you're willing to pay 3,600 euros for that. But you do that while saying, yeah, but I'm sacrificing myself. Look at what a good person I am for going there and helping those poor people at a local level. And so the psychological dynamics that are at the basis of your behavior then are very, very deep and very powerful, but we don't recognize it. So if you were to say, I am just gonna go to Costa Rica because it's good for me, and I'm grateful that I can go there because it strengthens my life and all that, and it's wonderful, and I hope that the people will be okay with me being there, that that would be a whole different dynamic than you saying I'm there to help other people and I'm ignoring the fact that really the person I'm helping is myself.
And then to make matters worse, because social media and our generation is as selfish as we are, then it comes to posting about it on social media. I mean, if I see these posts on social media where there's I sometimes it's even my friends, but then you have a white person, a European person coming to an African town teaching English, and then you have these pictures of them surrounded by black children who are all cheering and laughing and happy, and then there's one of them on their arm, and everyone is smiling, and then posting these pictures on social media. And even worse, as you already mentioned, it's also to further someone's career, going then further and posting it on LinkedIn, saying, "Oh, I've had such a transformative experience, and now I'm a changed person. I understand what these people need and what they. I understand their sorrows, and I lived with them. Even worse, I lived with them, like them for a significant amount of time. Now I know what it means to suffer. That that to me seems to. I mean, it might not be the most damaging part, but to me, it seems like this is the most toxic part.
Well, and it's completely deluded, right? It's completely delusional. It's that it reminds me of those initiatives where incredibly rich people say, "I want to know what it feels like to be poor, and so I'm gonna live on a budget of 500 euros a month for 6 months, and then I will know poverty." But of course, you don't know poverty because you don't have the insecurity. You can always go back to your comfortable lifestyle if you want to, and it has nothing to do with the realities that actually poor people live in. If you go there for 2 months and then you go back and you say, "I know what they are about. I understand them now," then you're completely deluded about yourself. Because your dynamic with them has not been that of an equal. Your dynamic of that with them has not been you aligning yourself to them, but rather them aligning themselves towards you. They adjust to you, you don't adjust to them, and it becomes a very delusional exercise. And that's why the aid sector, in many ways, is such a microcosm of the Western bubble at large that we discuss, right?
Which leads us perfectly to the fourth category. What's the damage? And here we divided this into damages on a macro level and damages on a micro level. What are the ones on a macro level?
Well, so you've got, first of all, the geopolitics. Through the aid sector is a sector that allows an awful lot of geopolitics. And with geopolitics, I mean countries, governments achieving selfish, if you like, self-centered aims to strengthen their country relative to that of other countries. Geopolitical aims are being facilitated by the aid sector. The aid sector allows you to pretend to be there for the other country, but in reality to achieve your own goals. And a good example of that is we'll provide you with this aid package for education, for young children in your communities, but by the way, after we sign this contract with you, you need to have a call with our multinationals who have seen some oil wells that they're interested in, right? It is this vague connection that the aid sector allows governments to create with locals in order to achieve their goals, and that becomes very damaging very very quickly. Um, Currently, sub-Saharan Africa is a battleground between Western powers and China when it comes to natural resources, when it comes to cultural impact, and the aid sector is a tool for that power, especially from the Western perspective. The Chinese are a little bit clearer about, hey, we just want your natural resources, what do we pay to get it? They're a little bit more simple, straightforward, less hypocritical. But the West still builds on this image that it has of itself as the do-gooders, the ones who are here to make the world a better place, and in the meantime, they're advancing their own strategic goals in developing countries, which is incredibly harmful for those countries, and it's also in the long term harmful for the image of the West, because the West is becoming increasingly exposed as complete hypocrites, which allows a country like China to slowly take over global dynamics.
And then the second part, when it comes to macro damages, is, and I want to be careful here because when I call this a waste of resources, as we mentioned in the beginning, this is not saying that all development and aid is wasteful, and whether development aid is a good or bad thing, we will assess later on. But isn't it also an enormous waste of resources, especially when we look at Afghanistan now? Afghanistan was the top receiver of aid in the last decade, 37 or 38 billion dollars, and look where the country is now. There, it does not seem like anything has changed or anything has significantly improved, especially not if you take into account, okay, what else could have been achieved with this money if it had been spent in a better way.
Yeah, so I mean, Afghanistan is, of course, absolutely worst example, you can find good examples of effective aid spending as well, obviously, but Afghanistan is an example where billions and billions and billions, hundreds of billions even, of euros, dollars have been spent without any significant long-term impact. Some micro impact here and there, but no long-term macro impact. And that is important. And I think in general, you could make this case about the aid sector. So the aid sector has a real difficulty in showing its positive impact. And you could argue, well, that is just because it's very hard to measure. And by the way, there's a whole army of experts dedicated and being paid a lot of money to find ways to measure aid impact, right? If anyone who works in the sector knows the incredible administrative hassle to go through with all kinds of logical framework to assess what they're achieving, because everyone understands that the aid sector is terrible in showing what it has actually achieved, because we just don't know. The aid sector not being able to explain how it has made the world a better place overall is a huge problem, because money is valuable. And with that I mean that it's not just neutral to spend money and then not to be able to show that it has had an impact, because that money could have been spent in other ways that would have been productive. Taxpayers' money, foundation money, whatever. Uh, if you say, well, we are saving lives currently in Afghanistan or Iraq or Somalia or wherever by spending this money, sure, but at what cost? Because with those resources, you could save the lives of many others in other situations, right? If we can spend €1 million on saving a child's life, most people would say, well, saving a child's life is the most important thing morally that we can do. So, of course, we have to do that. Yeah, but if that €1 million can save 100 children's lives elsewhere, in, for example, Children's Hospital, somewhere in Brooklyn, then you have a real moral conundrum there. And so the aid sector has been terrible, terrible, terrible at explaining how it actually has a long-term positive impact. And the reality is that it's almost impossible to show it because of the huge complexity of what it's involved in and the lack of client-supplier relation, because the locals are not the ones who assess the impact on their lives. It's the donors who assess the impact on the lives of locals.
And then moving on to the micro damages caused. And so, I mean, into mind comes at first, obviously, the local communities. Is it causing? See, because this was a question I always had during your class, and I think this is already going into the evaluation. You have all these damages caused, especially on a macro level, and let's say, okay, so there's certain, like there's a difficult power dynamic going on between the donor and the receiver. But in the end, whether a school has been built, and yes, people are being taught about democracy one session, but is that damage overall? Because, like, in the end, you could say, I mean, if you do it, if you create a mathematical equation, you could claim that they are better off than before.
Yeah, no, if a listener who works in the aid sector or who has donated a lot of her money to the aid sector could now send in a list of 100 or 1,000 aid projects that, at least from what we can tell, had a good positive impact on local communities. You can make a very long list of projects that probably had a good impact. I, as an evaluator, saw projects from, as far as I could tell, were actually very positive projects. Water tanks in southern India, which just helped local communities that didn't have running water, and it helped them in many, many different ways. Not everything was perfect about it, but there were clear benefits. Whether it was completely efficient is a different thing, but sure. So you're absolutely right that you can make this list of positive impact projects. Now, there's one caveat there, that it's very hard to measure secondary effects. It's very hard to measure, even in those positive projects, to measure what the long-term politics of it is. For example, you help one town with running water, but how about the next town? Do they lose out because all of a sudden they're no longer competitive because they don't have the same access to water as the town you just helped, right? It's very hard to actually isolate correctly the impact of your project. Having said that, anyone who doesn't like the sector can also send us a list of 1,000 projects that have been absolutely terrible, just really, really bad. And I'm not even talking about abuse by the sector, like the Haiti example that you just gave, but also that we're supposed to do one thing and that then led to all kinds of horrible secondary circumstances, like an irrigation project that then took water away from villagers elsewhere and led to a drought elsewhere, or a housing project that took away the forest necessary for wildlife, or the other way around, a forestry project that took away the agricultural lands for people to make a living off, leading to starvation. You can make a very, very long list of absolutely terrible projects that had terrible impact. Now, our question is, the problem is, how do you balance those two, that good list versus that bad list? And we don't have a way to balance it. We don't have a way to actually measure what the overall impact is. And you can't look at the macro picture for micro effects, because you don't know what it would be like in a parallel universe without aid. Would Africa over the past 60 years have been better off if no aid had been given at all? My gut instinct tells me yes. It would have been better if the aid sector hadn't existed at all. But I don't have any way to prove that, because I can't look into that parallel universe where that has happened, because that just doesn't exist from our reality. And so um, the problem is that, yes, you can point at good projects, but that doesn't mean that the aid sector is a legitimate sector in terms of actual long-term impact in our world.
See, and one of the thoughts that I personally found most convincing in your class is that you make these communities, but as well the countries that are receiving aid, dependent. That you rob them of an opportunity to either develop this themselves, or that at some point aid dries up. We saw this during COVID. During the beginning of COVID, suddenly money had to be spent elsewhere. Aid and development like paths dried up, and suddenly communities that have become dependent on a constant stream of aid were suffering even more than before.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's not just that economic dependence, but also political. And this goes back all the way to the origin, to the beginning of the modern aid sector, right? Where it was kind of based on that dependence, where that's exactly, explicitly or implicitly, what European societies wanted. They wanted those newly independent African or Southeast Asian countries to continue to be dependent on Europeans. And that is very damaging for many reasons. Not just for the resilience aspect that you mentioned, that if something goes wrong, then all of a sudden they've got nothing to stand on, but also because that allows these Western societies to impose their will on those local populations. If you don't do this, we will withdraw, and then all of a sudden people will starve again in your societies.
So after you already outlined that it's incredibly difficult to establish any, any final judgment on whether aid any specific project has been successful or not. Then let me ask this question that will break it down to three options. Has the development aid then been good, neutral, or bad? Here you have to now break down incredibly complex industry down to three different categories.
Well, if you want a simplistic answer, as I just explained, I have no way to prove it, but instinctively, in broad dynamics, and this is not about any specific local community, but broadly for the world, I believe the aid sector has been bad. It has a bad impact on the world, and that is based on an analysis of long-term dynamics, um, on an analysis of the development of countries and the development of international connections between the West and these countries. Does that mean that there are no societies or communities that have benefited from it? No, of course there are. There have been a lot of communities, a lot of people's lives are probably have been saved because of aid projects, probably. But overall, my gut instinct tells me that the overall impact has been bad. However, I don't have numbers to prove that. Nobody does, in neither direction.
So, to our listeners, based on your assessment, should they stop donating to to development organizations?
The thing is, if it makes you feel good, do it for your own well-being. But if so, think carefully about what kind of organizations you donate to. There are differences between organizations. I personally have stopped any of that. I mean, I used to in a long time. I don't donate to NGOs anymore. I've been too burned by what I've seen from the inside. Um, but there are differences. Some organizations are much more locally led, right? By local communities, wherever you go. We mentioned Kenya or Tanzania that have local communities that just say we want financial resources to help us develop our agricultural sector or to help us develop our schools. That is a very different story from compared to an NGO in London who just decides for Tanzania or decides for Kenya what they should do and how they should behave. So if you're gonna donate, do make a distinction between what kind of NGO is out there. Those that are controlled by local people, owned by local people, are very different than those who are controlled by people in Paris or London or Madrid. As an economist, just from a very simplistic macro perspective, if you've got one region where there is an overabundance of labor and not sufficient capital, and another where there is an overabundance of capital but not sufficient labor, what you want is an exchange between those two regions. So we go back to international cooperation. The idea of capital flowing to places where capital is not as abundant makes a lot of sense to me. And if you want to be part of that, that in itself, the idea makes sense. Just know that there's this very corrupt and very problematic sector in between your ability to do that, in between you and them and your ability to connect to that local society.
And then from here, we only have one more category left. What is the future? So we established international cooperation is good. That international, well, development aid in a top-down matter is not. But where do we take it from here?
If the West can stop being like Mother Teresa and just be open about what they want, in a way like China is doing, then that would be a very positive step forward, saying we're not gonna hide behind this aid concept as such. We're not gonna hide behind the idea that we're supposedly doing good for the world. We just want natural resources from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we're gonna get that through providing money for infrastructure, just like the Chinese do. That would be a much more open, clear kind of relationship. And it would make them actually more competitive because currently what you see is that sub-Saharan governments are getting completely fed up with Europeans and their morality twisted with self-interest.
And here we get to another essay I wrote in that aid and development class I took with you, where I believe I made the point that this increased competition between China, the West, and other players is creating a better situation locally because now locals can choose, do we want the Chinese giving us money in exchange for resources, a very clear-cut deal. We've seen, I mean, hopefully, we have seen what happens in other countries with this. I mean, Sri Lanka is the most recent example that comes to mind. Or do we want the Western money that comes with all these strings attached? Or maybe is there another player, another big donor that is coming around the corner and wants to give us money?
Exactly. It's interesting that what you see often at the local level is that the Chinese are not very popular. At the local level, I mean small community level, the Chinese are not very popular in because they don't really interact with locals. They don't really benefit the local communities very much. But at a governmental level, the Chinese government is really effective at partnering up with um, African or Asian governments because they can just do business, and that's a much that competitive spirit is something that the West can learn from, and that would actually benefit the world. Just say this is what we offer, take it or leave it. If the Chinese offer something better, you can go with them, and you can see that Africa has benefited from this dynamic, right? It has benefited from this competitive new environment that didn't exist before. Before it was neocolonialism or nothing. And now it is actually choices that are being offered to local governments. Um, Having said that, there are of course still people who want to just be in contact with local communities without a geopolitical interest. There are NGOs, there are students in Germany, in Spain, who want to connect to local populations elsewhere. And if you do that, please do so. But be open about how it benefits you, and be open towards yourself. Be clear about it. Be explicit. This is what I'm getting out of this relationship, and I'm grateful for myself to be able to have this relationship because it helps my career, it helps my experiences, and it's great if the locals also get something out of it, because then it's a cooperative kind of connection. That's something that we should only encourage, right? But let's not pretend that you go as an 18 or 19-year-old, you go to Costa Rica and you go there out of the goodness of your heart, and people should congratulate you for the great work you're doing. You're there for you, and be open about that.
And that you then fully understand the dynamics of Costa Rica, the rainforest, and everything else after going there for 3 months, a week, or I mean, maybe even a few years. It only comes after years and years of.
Don't make any claims. As a general rule, don't make any claims about understanding other people. I think understanding ourselves is difficult enough. Let's not try to pretend that we understand others.
And this seems like a great moment to end today's conversation on Development 8. If you have any questions, comments, or regards, make sure to send us an email to jhasenstab@rayagroup.org. We will try to incorporate them in our following episodes. Thank you very much to the listeners for joining us today. Make sure to join us again next week when we burst the Western bubble. That is it from my side. Balder, which closing quote did you bring for us today?
So I decided to go back to the very foundations of our Western society, Socrates. A system of morality which is based on relative emotional values is a mere illusion, a thoroughly vulgar conception which has nothing sound in it and nothing true.